It was a chilly autumn morning in the sleepy English village of Ashcombe, nestled somewhere between the rolling hills of the Cotswolds and the bustling city of Oxford. I had just finished setting up the tiny medical room that doubled as the village's health outpost. It was 8:45 a.m., the clock ticking closer to 9 o'clock when I was officially due to start my first day on the job. The nerves were electric, buzzing under my skin in a way that made my hands tremble as I arranged the medical forms and sterilized instruments on the worn wooden table. I wasn't just a student anymore, this was real. My first solo day as the village's newest healthcare provider. No more supervisors hovering, no more second chances. I was responsible for people's health, real breathing human beings. If I messed up, someone could get hurt. I smoothed down the navy blue blouse I had chosen that morning, paired with a knee-length skirt that hugged my hips just enough to remind me I was still a woman despite the serious new role I had assumed. My dark brown hair was pinned back with a simple silver clip, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame my face, softening the professional mask I wore. My navy leather flats tapped nervously on the floor as I checked and rechecked my notes. I felt like a debutante about to walk into her first ball, except instead of a dance, I was opening my doors to a village of expectant, often ailing villagers. The first to trickle in were the elderly ladies, clutching their walking sticks and handbag-sized pillboxes. They all wanted a checkup, blood pressure readings, advice on medication, reassurance that the arthritis in their knuckles wouldn't flare up again. I dutifully scribbled notes, nodded, offered advice, and smiled through the growing swell of anxiety. I knew most of them weren't really ill. This was more like a social call, a chance to see the new face in town and maybe get a bit of company. But then a man shuffled in, catching my eye in a way that made my heart jump. He was an older gentleman, probably in his late 70s, dressed in a thick tweed jacket with patches on the elbows, well-worn corduroy trousers, and a flat cap perched crookedly on his head. One hand was propped awkwardly by the other as he moved slowly toward me. When he removed his jacket, I saw the problem. A swollen red hand wrapped in a dirty rag. The kind of injury I'd hoped never to see on my first day. I tried not to gasp. "How did you let it get like this?" I thought, but didn't say aloud. It looked painful, raw, and seriously infected. His finger was swollen and the skin around it flushed deep crimson, the kind of thing that could easily spiral into something much worse if left untreated. He muttered something about it being nothing, a mere scratch from brambles in his garden. "Just thought it'd clear up on its own," he said with a stubborn shake of his head. "Put a cabbage leaf on it last night. Sure it'd ease by morning." I fought the urge to laugh at the old remedy but held my tongue. This was serious. I explained in as gentle a tone as I could muster that he needed to get to the hospital in Oxford, to see a specialist surgeon immediately. I tried to impress on him the danger. Gangrene was a real risk, and in the worst-case scenario he could lose his hand. His response was a mix of disbelief and defiance. "Lose my hand? How am I supposed to manage the farm? My wife's passed on. I'm the only one left to tend to the animals and the land." He looked at me as though I was suggesting he chop off his own leg just for a laugh. "I won't be going anywhere. No buses, no hospitals. This is my home." I could see the stubborn pride in his eyes, the kind that keeps people tied to their land and their routines, no matter the cost. I pressed him again, trying to make him understand that this wasn't about inconvenience but survival. "At the very least, let me dress the wound and monitor it," I offered, hoping to bridge the gap between his pride and his health. But he shook his head and stuffed the referral note I'd written into his jacket pocket, mumbling as he left. After that, the day seemed to drag, the bustle of the morning fading into a quiet lull. I felt the weight of every moment, every patient I hadn't yet met. By the time I closed up the little clinic, the sun was dipping low, and the chill in the air was growing sharper. I packed my bag with care, not yet ready to leave my new post completely behind. The room where I was staying, a modest but cozy flat above the village's only bakery, awaited me. Mrs. Harper, the kindly landlady who had taken me in while I waited for my own place to be renovated, was already there, sitting in her floral armchair, knitting needles clicking away as the evening wore on. She gave me a knowing look as I dropped my bag by the door. "Tell me everything," she said with a smile that tried to hide concern. I sank into the armchair opposite her, exhaustion washing over me. "So many people today," I said, rubbing my temples. "And that old man with the infected hand. I sent him to the hospital, but I don't know if he'll go." My voice cracked slightly. "It's harder than I thought. They don't want to listen. Mrs. Harper nodded slowly but said nothing, her silence speaking volumes about the challenges that lay ahead. The next morning, barely awake and still haunted by the previous day's events, I was startled by a sudden knock and the appearance of a young man at my door. Breathless and wide-eyed, he urged me to come quickly. Someone in the village was in trouble. Without hesitation, I grabbed my medical kit and followed him outside, where an old tractor was waiting, its engine rumbling like a sleeping beast. The man introduced himself as Tim, the local woodsman, who often helped out with emergencies in the more remote parts of the village. The rickety tractor was the only way to reach where I needed to go, narrow, muddy paths that no car could navigate. As we bounced along the uneven forest track, Tim explained that the trouble was with a young man named Alex, known in the village for his struggles with drink and a tendency to cause chaos. If he's drinking again, Tim said grimly, he's likely to hurt himself or someone else. Last time he ended up nearly losing a finger. I clutched the sides of my seat as the tractor jolted and swayed, the late afternoon sun filtering through the thick canopy above, casting dappled shadows that danced over the dirt road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the sterile smell of antiseptic I was used to. When we arrived, the scene was tense. Alex was slumped in a battered old caravan, surrounded by a group of men who looked both protective and exasperated. One of them, a burly fellow named Sam, had a bandaged leg, apparently the result of a recent accident involving an axe, which seemed fitting given the lumberjack vibe of the crew. I unpacked my supplies quickly and set to work, cleaning and dressing the wound while the men watched silently. Alex's eyes were glassy, his breath uneven, but when I injected the sedative to dull the pain, he seemed to relax, sinking into a peaceful sleep that was a rare mercy. While I worked, my mind raced. This village was nothing like the polished wards of the city hospitals I'd been trained in. Here people lived by their own rules, stubborn and fiercely independent. The old man with the infected hand, Alex with his demons, the quiet judgment from the shopkeeper earlier. It all painted a picture of a community wary of outsiders and protective of their OW&B. By the time we returned to Ashcombe, night had fallen, and the stars blanketed the sky in a cold, indifferent shimmer. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. This was only the beginning. I was no longer just a student or a trainee. I was the village's lifeline, for better or worse. Back at my flat, Mrs. Harper was waiting with a cup of tea and a warm smile. She listened patiently as I recounted the day's events, offering wisdom wrapped in gentle encouragement. "You'll find your place here, love," she said softly. "Just remember, it's not just about medicine. It's about trust." The days that followed were a whirlwind of challenges. I visited old Mr. Edgerton again, this time determined not to let his pride endanger him. I dressed his wound carefully, explaining the dangers as kindly as I could, watching his eyes soften just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The village began to change around me too. The wary glances from the bakery turned into nods of recognition. The gruff men who once questioned my presence started to share stories, to invite me into their world, or at least a corner of it. And somewhere beneath it all, I felt a fire ignite, a mixture of stubbornness and hope, a promise to prove that even in the quietest, most stubborn corners of England, a woman like me could make a difference. That maybe, just maybe, I could become more than the outsider everyone expected me to be. But as the first leaves began to fall and the chill of winter whispered through the village, a shadow lingered at the edge of my new life, a secret waiting to unravel, a test that would challenge everything I thought I knew about healing, trust, and the strength it takes to belong. The weeks that followed settled into a strange rhythm, one that felt both familiar and foreign. Each morning I'd wake before dawn, pulling on my crisp white blouse and charcoal gray skirt, the fabric hugging my waist in that delicate way that made me feel both professional and, if I'm honest, a little bit alluring. I'd slip on my sensible black leather shoes, polished to a muted shine, and fasten a silver locket around my neck, a gift from my mother that rested just above my collarbone, a reminder of the life I'd left behind in London. Ashcombe was waking up as I stepped outside. The village was wrapped in a pale mist, the kind that turns the cobblestone paths slippery, and makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. The bakery's warm golden light spilled onto the street, mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread and the faint aroma of roasting coffee beans. The familiar creak of Mrs. Harper's front door opening was a comforting soundtrack to my mornings now that I was becoming part of the village fabric, thread by thread, though not without resistance. The shopkeeper's sideways glances hadn't entirely disappeared. and whispers still followed me down the lane, but there was also a cautious warmth beneath it all. The villagers were like the weather here. Unpredictable, sometimes stormy, but always worth braving if you wanted to see the sun. One crisp afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, I found myself heading toward the village hall. There was an air of quiet urgency about Ashcombe these days, like the calm before a storm. I'd been summoned to tend to a new patient, a woman named Grace who lived on the outskirts of the village in a quaint cottage surrounded by wildflowers and tangled ivy. Pulling my coat tighter around me, I walked the narrow lane lined with ancient oaks, their leaves crunching underfoot. The cottage appeared suddenly, as if it had grown out of the earth itself, its whitewashed walls glowing softly in the fading light. Grace greeted me at the door, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose bun, strands escaping to frame a face that looked both delicate and strong, a contradiction I found endlessly fascinating. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and wood smoke. Grace was seated in a high-backed armchair, her slender fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She was dressed in a flowing cream blouse that hinted at the curve of her shoulders, paired with a soft skirt that whispered as she moved. There was something quietly magnetic about her, a presence that filled the room without effort. Her injury was a deep bruise on her ankle, swollen and throbbing from a fall she'd taken while tending to her garden. As I examined it, my fingers brushing lightly over the tender skin, I felt a spark of connection, a fragile intimacy born from the trust she placed in me. I wrapped the ankle carefully, making sure not to cause her pain, and offered advice on rest and elevation. She smiled, that soft, enigmatic smile that makes you wonder what secrets lie behind it. I could sense the loneliness in her voice when she spoke about living alone since her husband passed, and the village's reluctance to reach out. It was a reminder that beneath the picturesque surface, isolation ran deep here. Leaving her cottage, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The village was changing me, peeling back layers I hadn't known I was carrying. I was no longer just a doctor. I was a confidant, a guardian of whispered sorrows and hidden wounds. Back at the clinic, the evening was settling in, and the low hum of the village was punctuated by the soft chatter drifting in from the Fox and Hound pub nearby. I locked the door behind me, the cool air brushing against my skin, and paused to glance back at the warmly lit windows. Inside, shadows danced as laughter and music spilled out, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of my own life. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling around my fingers, and sank into the worn armchair by the window. As I watched the moon rise over the village rooftops, I wondered what the coming days would bring. The people of Ashcombe were a puzzle, their stories tangled and complex, and I was determined to piece them together, even if it meant confronting the darker corners of this peaceful village. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet thrill stirred. This was more than a job. It was a journey, one that would test my limits, my heart, and perhaps reveal parts of myself I had long kept hidden. And as the night wrapped its velvet cloak around Ashcombe, I knew I was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, with compassion, and with a fierce determination to belong. The village of Ashcombe had a way of settling into your bones, like the subtle chill of an early morning fog that refuses to lift. By now, I had learned to read its quiet signals, the cautious nods from the farmers at the market, the half-smiles exchanged over cups of bitter tea at the pub, the way the postman tipped his hat just a little longer when he thought no one was watching. Yet beneath the surface there was a current of tension, a secret pulse that kept the village from fully opening up. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight spilled through the lace curtains of my small flat, I found myself staring at the reflection in the mirror. My chestnut hair was loosely pinned back, a few strands escaping to soften my sharp cheekbones. My pale blue dress clung modestly to my figure, the fabric whispering against my skin with the faintest hint of warmth. I had chosen it for its balance, professional yet feminine, a quiet invitation to be taken seriously without losing my own identity. Today was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to unravel. I stepped out onto the cobbled street, my polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm as I made my way towards the village green. The usual bustle was muted. Conversations had a hushed urgency, and eyes flicked in my direction with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The old oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching wide like protective arms, stood sentinel over the heart of Ashcombe. A group had gathered near the notice board, a motley crew of villagers ranging from weather-beaten farmers to young mothers with weary eyes. At their center was Thomas, a tall man with a stern jaw and a shock of silver hair, known for his no-nonsense approach to village affairs. He caught my gaze and nodded curtly, a silent acknowledgement that something was amiss. I approached cautiously, ready to offer my help, my medical bag slung over one shoulder. Thomas's voice, usually steady, carried an edge as he spoke of a mysterious illness spreading through the livestock, cows growing weak overnight, sheep found trembling in the fields, and the once bustling farmyards falling silent. The implications were grave. If the animals succumbed, the village's fragile economy would collapse, leaving families destitute and desperate. But more than that, there was an unspoken fear that the sickness might cross over to people. An invisible threat lurking in the shadows. I felt the weight of their silent pleas. This was no longer just about treating bruises and broken bones. It was about safeguarding the very soul of Ashcombe. Returning to the clinic, I dove into research, poring over veterinary journals and infectious disease manuals. The flickering light of my desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls as I worked late into the night, the hum of the village outside a distant murmur. I knew I was out of my depth, but the responsibility drove me onward. The following days were a whirlwind of visits to farms, where I examined the animals with a mixture of clinical detachment and growing dread. The symptoms were baffling: fever, lethargy, and a strange pallor that no one could explain. The farmers watched me with a blend of skepticism and desperation, their weathered hands gripping pitchforks as if to ward off the invisible enemy. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows over the fields, I found myself standing alone beside a sickly cow, its eyes dull and unfocused. I knelt beside it, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead as I whispered promises of help, of hope. The cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth and fading wildflowers, a poignant reminder of the fragility of life. Back in the village, whispers grew louder, rumors of curses, of old grudges stirring beneath the soil. Some spoke of the land being punished for forgotten sins, others blamed outsiders like me for bringing misfortune. I felt the sting of their mistrust, a sharp contrast to the warmth I had hoped to find. Yet amid the fear and suspicion, there were moments of unexpected kindness. Grace, the woman with the injured ankle, sent a basket of wildflowers to the clinic, a silent thank you that made my heart swell. Tim, the woodsman, offered to help me gather herbs and remedies from the forest, his steady presence a balm to my fraying nerves. One night, as I prepared to close the clinic, a shadow slipped through the door. A figure cloaked in darkness, face obscured but eyes gleaming with urgency. I felt a chill run down my spine as the stranger handed me a folded piece of paper, the ink smeared as if written in haste. The message was brief but chilling: the sickness is not what it seems. Trust no one. My breath caught in my throat. Who had sent this? What did it mean? And most unsettling of all, was I already in danger? I folded the note carefully, slipping it into my pocket as the stranger melted back into the night. The village was whispering secrets and I was caught in the middle, a lone figure navigating a landscape of shadows and half-dashed truths. As I locked the clinic doors behind me, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on my shoulders. The fog was thickening, and with it, the veil over Ashcombe's darkest mysteries. I was beginning to realize that healing this village would require more than medicine. It would demand courage, instinct, and perhaps a touch of recklessness. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice urged me onward, promising that the answers I sought were just beyond the horizon, if only I dared to chase them. The chill in the air had deepened into a biting cold by the time I awoke the next morning, the gray dawn casting long shadows across my bedroom floor. I pulled my fingers through my hair, tousled and damp from restless sleep, and wrapped a soft woolen scarf around my neck before slipping into my boots. The village was still wrapped in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant crow of a rooster and the crunch of frost beneath my feet as I stepped outside. The weight of the cryptic note pressed against my chest like a lead weight. The sickness is not what it seems. Trust no one. Those words echoed relentlessly in my mind as I made my way toward the clinic. Every face I passed seemed to hold a secret, every glance a hidden meaning. The village of Ashcombe was a living puzzle, and I was the outsider trying desperately to piece it together before it was too late. At the clinic, I set about preparing for the day, my fingers moving methodically over bandages and antiseptics, but my mind was elsewhere. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the door, half expecting the shadowed figure from last night to appear again. Instead, the quiet was broken by a knock at the window. Turning, I saw Tim standing outside, his rugged features set in a grim line, eyes sharp and alert. He motioned urgently for me to follow, and without hesitation, I grabbed my coat and medical bag. The biting wind whipped around us as we hurried through the narrow village lanes toward the edge of the forest. The woods loomed like a dark cathedral, the skeletal branches scraping the leaden sky. Tim led me to a clearing where a group of villagers had gathered, faces pale with worry and eyes wide with fear. In the center lay an animal, its body convulsing slightly, breath shallow and ragged as I knelt beside it. The familiar clinical detachment I tried to cultivate slipped away, replaced by a raw urgency. The symptoms were worse than I'd feared. Rapid weight loss, discoloration of the gums, and a strange, almost unnatural stiffness in its limbs. I worked quickly, taking samples and administering what relief I could. One of the farmers, a wiry man named Jack with dirt-streaked hands and a permanent scowl, watched me closely. His mistrust was palpable, and when I suggested quarantining the animals, he scoffed. "You think we can just lock up the whole bloody farm? What do you think this is, some city fancy's idea?" I swallowed the retort that rose unbidden. This was Ashcombe, where tradition often outweighed reason, and every suggestion had to be earned through patience and persistence. But patience was a luxury I wasn't sure I had. That evening back at the clinic I found a small package waiting on the doorstep. Inside was a bundle of dried herbs, carefully wrapped in a faded linen cloth, and a note in familiar handwriting. "For when the science isn't enough, Grace." Her gesture was small but significant, a quiet act of solidarity in a village that seemed to measure trust in whispers and sideways glances. I tucked the herbs into my bag, feeling a flicker of hope amid the growing darkness. But the sense of foreboding only deepened as the days passed. More animals fell ill, and whispers of curses and old village grudges spread like wildfire. Even Tim, usually so steady and unflappable, seemed to carry a shadow behind his eyes. One night, as I locked up the clinic, a sudden noise made me freeze. A soft rustling behind the hedge, the barely audible crunch of footsteps on frost-hardened earth. I turned sharply, heart hammering, to find a figure stepping out of the gloom. It was Grace, her eyes bright with urgency, breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She pressed a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. "You need to see this," she whispered. The note was scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as if written in haste. "They're watching. The sickness is a warning. Don't trust the council." Before I could ask what she meant, Grace vanished into the night, leaving me clutching the cryptic message and 1,000 questions burning in my mind. The village council was the heart of Ashcombe's power, a tight-knit group of elders who ruled with quiet authority. To accuse them of anything sinister was to invite suspicion and danger. Yet the note's warning gnawed at me. A poison seed planted in fertile ground. I spent the night poring over village records and old newspaper clippings, searching for any hint of past scandals or cover-ups. The deeper I dug, the more tangled the web became. Stories of land disputes, mysterious disappearances, and whispered alliances that stretched back generations. By dawn, I was exhausted but resolute. This was no ordinary outbreak. It was a symptom of something far darker. And if I was going to protect this village, I would have to navigate its shadows carefully, learning who to trust and when to hold my tongue. As the morning sun broke through the mist, casting long golden beams across Ashcombe, I felt the first stirrings of determination. I was no longer just a healer of wounds and bruises. I was becoming a guardian of secrets, a seeker of truths hidden beneath layers of history and silence, and somewhere, deep in the heart of the village, the real danger was waiting, patient, watching, and ready to strike. The game had changed. And so had I. The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing at the edge of the village green, the cold biting through my coat as I scanned the faces gathered there. The usual hum of Ashcombe was replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the distant barking of a dog, and the soft rustle of dead leaves skittering across the cobblestones. The villagers looked worn, their eyes shadowed with worry and suspicion, the kind of suspicion that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Thomas was there, his silver hair glinting in the pale light, his jaw set firm as he addressed the crowd. I recognized the urgency in his voice, but the words felt hollow, as if there was more he wasn't saying. I wanted to reach out, to tell them I was here to help, but the space between us felt vast and cold. As the crowd dispersed, I noticed Grace lingering behind, her striking auburn hair catching the weak sunlight. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between us. A shared burden that neither of us could yet fully explain. The day stretched on with a relentless pace, each knock on the clinic door bringing new worries. A sprained ankle here, a stubborn cough there, but always the undercurrent of something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. I treated each patient with care, my hands steady even as my mind raced. That afternoon, Tim arrived with a basket of herbs and a determined look. "I think it's time you meet someone," he said, nodding toward the edge of the village. Curiosity prickled at me as I followed him down a narrow lane, the houses growing sparse until we reached a small cottage shrouded in ivy. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and herbs. An elderly woman sat by the fire, her eyes sharp and bright despite the lines etched deep into her face. She introduced herself as Maud, the village's herbalist and keeper of old knowledge. Her hands were gnarled but sure as she showed me remedies passed down through generations, their power rooted in the land itself. Maud's presence was a balm to my frayed nerves, her stories weaving a tapestry of Ashcombe's past, its secrets, its curses, and the delicate balance that held it together. She warned me that the sickness was not just a physical ailment but a manifestation of deeper unrest, a symptom of broken trust and buried truths. That night, as I lay awake listening to the wind whispering through the trees, I felt the weight of her words settle over me. The village was a living thing, its heart beating in time with its people's fears and hopes. To heal Ashcombe, I would have to do more than mend wounds. I would have to unravel the threads of its history, confront its shadows, and find the courage to stand alone if necessary. Days blurred together in a whirlwind of house calls, late-night consultations, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. The sickness spread, and with it, the cracks in the village's facade deepened. I felt eyes on me constantly, some filled with gratitude, others with doubt, and a few with something darker, unreadable. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised shade of purple and the first stars blinked awake, I found myself walking the lonely path to Grace's cottage. She was waiting on the porch wrapped in a shawl, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I have something you need to see," she said, leading me inside. On the table lay a collection of letters and faded photographs, evidence of long-hidden disputes and alliances that stretched back decades. The village council was at the center of it all, their hands stained with secrets they would kill to protect us. I sifted through the papers. A sudden knock startled us. The door creaked open and Thomas stepped inside, his face unreadable. The tension in the room thickened like fog. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, eyes flicking between us. "Some things are better left buried." But I had come too far to turn back now. The truth was out there, tangled and dangerous, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. And as the night deepened, I realized that in Ashcombe, every secret had a price, and I was about to pay mine.